This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 14 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, I'm going to give you 7 ways to support student writing in any content area. Hi, thanks so much for downloading and listening. I have a lot of really good stuff to share with you in this episode, but before I do, I just want to ask you a quick favor. If you've been listening for a while and you're enjoying the work I'm doing, go on over to iTunes and give the podcast a rating and a review. This will help a lot in terms of making the podcast more visible and helping it reach more people. To the 14 people who have done this so far, thank you so much. It helps more than you know. Okay, so in this episode, we're going to talk about things that you can do to support student writing in any content area. And primarily, I'm talking about people who are non-English language arts teachers. My personal teaching background is in English language arts. I was a, most of the time, middle school language arts teacher. And the idea of helping students improve their writing in other areas is not really a new one. It used to just be called reading and writing across the content. Or across the curriculum. But when the Common Core came along, in the United States anyway, it became a requirement. Within the Common Core standards for English language arts, there is a section called Literacy in History, Social Studies, Science, and Technical Subjects. And by technical subjects, they mean anything that is not English language arts. So it can be a PE class or a life skills class or pretty much anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be technical. But what this does is it requires teachers of all content areas to support student skills in reading and writing. You're not necessarily teaching those. You're just sort of supporting them, or you're making sure that students are doing those things and helping them out if they're not. And I'm not going to go through all those standards because some of my listeners are not even in the United States. But I do think that this idea that students are reading and writing in every class that they're in, and that therefore we should be all sort of working together to help them improve their reading and writing is a sound one, and it is definitely not a new idea, and it's not reserved to the United States anyway. So I've pretty firmly believe in this idea also. But the problem is that I think when somebody is a social studies teacher or a math teacher or a science teacher, or they're teaching in some other content area, they hear this and they get a little freaked out because they think, hey, I am not a writing person, or I'm not a literature person, or I'm not good at grammar, I'm not good at spelling. That's not what I studied. So why am I supposed to teach this stuff? Or they think this is going to take away from all the time I need to spend teaching my content. So before I start to get into some of the strategies I'm going to talk to you about, one little bit of reassurance, which is that you are not expected to be a great speller or know all the grammar rules, or you're certainly not expected to correct for all of those things either. What you're being asked to do when somebody suggests that you support student writers or student readers in your content area is that A, you ask students to do some reading and writing, which is pretty much a given, and B, when they do that you support their use of certain skills, that you ask them to write with a certain amount of detail, of supporting evidence, that when they write something that they write it in a way that is well organized. I am going to be getting into the reading part of this, by the way, in another podcast. That'll be a little bit further down the line, but I will also talk about ways to support student readers in the content areas. This time I'm just going to focus on writing. But I do believe that there are things that we can all do to sort of send out a common unified message of this is what good writing looks like, and help them build the habits of good writers no matter what content area they're working in. So, and before I get started, let me also address this whole question of I'm not a good speller. And I think that for somebody who doesn't have a lot of training in how to teach writing, there is that misconception that the way that you do it is to just check everybody's spelling and mark them for punctuation mistakes and that sort of thing. Those things are important, but that is only one small piece of all of the different skills that a student needs to be a good writer. So what I'm going to talk about in this episode are 7 things that you can do. And actually, there's going to be an 8th tip too, a bonus tip. But 7 things that you can do in your class that really are not going to take a whole lot of time away from your content area. They can be woven into your regular teaching. But these are ways that you can support student writing while you're teaching your regular content and help students become better writers while they're learning your content. So, let's get started. Number 1 is understand how the writing process works. Now, this isn't even something that you have to do. This is just a mindset that I want you to start to develop. One of the very first things I was taught in my training to become a writing teacher is this idea of the writing process. And I think for lots of people, they were never taught this. So a long time ago, I guess, before the idea of a writing process was ever introduced, teachers would teach this way. They would assign a piece of writing to students, and students would either go home and write it, or they would write it in class and hand it in. The teacher would give it a grade, and that would be the end of it. That was the end of the writing assignment. Whatever grade the kid got, that was the grade they got, and that was it. So, thankfully, in the last generation or so, people who study writing and people who study the teaching of writing have recognized that that is not really how a real writer works. They don't just sit down with a piece of paper, pick up a pen, and just start writing from beginning to end. It's a pretty messy process. And so the 5 stages of the writing process that most writers go to, and this is what we try to teach them in English language arts classes, are these 5 steps. The first is pre-writing. This is where you're planning out, brainstorming, outlining. This is anything that you do before you're actually trying to write paragraphs. So pre-writing is the first stage. The second stage is drafting. This is where you're actually trying to write out your sentences and actually craft something that looks like the final piece. But the writing is definitely not done then. Then you have the third step, which is revising. Revising is where you go back over the thing that you just drafted and you change it. Now, this is not really correcting for errors at this point. This is reorganizing things and identifying sections where this part here doesn't make sense. That part needs to go completely, and this part needs way more explanation. It's really tearing into this thing and kind of ripping it apart and reorganizing it. A lot of times when you're done revising, you go back to some of the drafting stages and you're trying so you kind of circle between drafting and revising for a while until you have something that looks more like a finished piece. Then you go into the 4th phase. And when I say you, I just mean writers in general. The 4th phase is editing. This is where the basic structure of the text is in place. It's pretty much ready to go. But then you got to go through and make sure it's all correct. Correctness is not the same as it being a well-written piece. A well-written piece means that the voice is clear and that the introduction grabs your attention and everything kind of flows together and there's organization, and then it finishes off with something that's pretty solid and you feel like you really understand it well. But then you got to go through and find all the little mistakes. You got to find the typos or the spelling errors or the places where the comma needs to be here, and don't forget to capitalize that. So you're really just polishing it off at the very end. And then the very final stage of the writing process is publishing. When you hear publishing, a lot of people think, it's in a magazine or it's in a book or it's in a newspaper, it's online, it's, for public consumption. But people who teach writing, we take a very, very broad view of what this word publishing means. Publishing could just mean I'm done with it and now I am going to read it out loud to the class, or my teacher's going to hang it on the wall, or there are lots and lots of different ways to publish a piece of writing. It basically just means you are saying, it's done, it's ready, here world, look at it. And then that world could just be your neighbor in class, but it's the act of sharing your final piece with someone. The reason I made this strategy number 1 to just understand how the writing process works is that if you haven't had any background in how writing instruction works, you might be tempted to just do it sort of the other way that I described, which is, here's the assignment, write it, I give it a score, we're done. And if your coursework is not very writing intensive, it would be really easy to be tempted to do that because you got to move on to studying your content more. But if you understand that students need a little bit of time to plan, to be in that pre-writing stage, they need a little bit of time to draft, They may need some revising time, and a lot of times this involves exchanging it with some other people in class or turning a draft into you and having you look over it and say, this part is working, this part needs a little bit more. That's the revising stage. They're still getting it right. And then also understanding that once they've gotten that right, they should be looking over it for mistakes, that they're not quite done yet. If you understand that, then sometimes the assignments that they give you could be more fluid. They don't have to just be this one-time thing. They could turn in an assignment and you could return it to them for more revision and then have it be submitted to you again. This is the way good writing happens. It doesn't happen in just one shot. It happens over time with more revision. So even just having that terminology down with the students, if you're going to give them an assignment, say, okay, let's do a little pre-writing together. These are probably terms they've heard someplace else in their English classes. In the pre-writing stage, a lot of students will use graphic organizers, or they've been taught to use graphic organizers. Find out what the other language arts people in your school are using. Get them used to using the same things in your class. It seems as if it would take a little bit more time, but if what they're writing about is your content area, then they're still interacting and engaging with your content. It's just more depth than they might get with a multiple choice test. Strategy number 2 is model all stages of the writing process. And what I mean by model is you do some writing with them. I did this all the time as a writing teacher, and I found it was the most effective way to get students to really learn how to put words down on paper and to put their thoughts on paper and get it done in an organized way. Because kids who are not really experienced writers, they think that a good writer sits down, like I was describing before, with a piece of paper and they just start writing, and this beautifully written piece just comes spewing out of their pen like that, from beginning to end, and then that's it. They don't understand how the process works. So if there is a task for students to do, suppose they have to write suppose that you're in history and they've got to pick an event in history and they've got to write a report on it, okay? You could pick your own event. And you could say to the kids, none of you get to do this one. I'm picking this one. Or maybe yours is from a different time period. And model for them the process of, okay, here's what I'm supposed to do with this. And actually do a think aloud right in front of them. Put your work on a projector. I used to do this on an overhead projector, but I know now that people can just open up a Word document and it can be projected right up on the screen. Show them how messy that process can be. You can start drafting in front of them, or you can start doing the pre-writing in front of them. Say, okay, I think I want to write about this event, and I'm supposed to talk about, 3 major parts of it, 3 major influences of it. So, and have the kids just sit there and watch you do this for a few minutes. If you've never done this, it's going to feel a little bit awkward, but they are going to so appreciate being able to see inside the head of somebody while they're trying to figure out writing. For some of them, it'll be the first time they've ever gotten to see that. And it's kind of life-changing for some kids to realize, oh, it's that simple. It's not any kind of mysterious skill that people have. It's that simple. You just sort of talk yourself in through it, and you start writing down stuff, and you end up getting rid of stuff, and you keep some stuff. And if you are a certified teacher, you have had to do writing assignments before. And so let them see how you do that. How would you approach a prompt, or how would you approach a constructed response on an exam? And then actually start writing it. And then don't worry about it being perfect, because the less perfect it is, the more it's going to help the students. Show them what it looks like when you say, okay, I think I've got this paragraph done, but I really don't like how that last sentence sounds. And even get them to help you. How would you rewrite this last part? Now, you don't necessarily have to consume an entire class period to have them watch you writing it from beginning to end, but as you work through the stages with them, show them how far along your part is. And you can do some parts of it at home, and you can kind of fake some of it a little bit. But the idea is for them to see what the thinking is behind how these pieces get written. So that's number 2. Number 3, provide sentence stems to help them craft their sentences. A lot of kids don't spend a whole lot of time reading academic language. They don't know how you actually put your ideas together in a sentence. This will help a lot in the drafting phase, when they've got everything organized now, they know what they're going to write, but they don't know how to say it. So one of the things that students have to do a lot in content area writing is they have to provide evidence for something. So if you show them sentence stems, and a sentence stem is just the beginning, the first few words of a sentence, followed by a blank line because they fill in the actual details. But if they have to provide evidence, then what you can do is show them 3 or 4 ways that you can actually write that in a sentence. So for example, you could write, this is demonstrated by blank, and then they would fill that in with the evidence. Or another sentence could read, evidence to support this can be found in, and then there's another blank after that. You can write these up on the board, you can turn them into posters, and you're permitting students to use these stems and construct their own sentences with them. If you show them how to use academic language, they are going to feel much more confident in actually trying to write this, because this is, for some of them, the first time they've ever really tried to do this. Even if it's not the first time, they may have failed at it before. So giving them some of the puzzle pieces that they can put together helps a lot. Okay, so we've already gone through 3. Number 1, understand how the writing process works. Number 2, model all stages of the writing process and write with them. Number 3, provide sentence stems. So number 4 is this: have students write in class. It's really easy and tempting to say, okay, here's your assignment. I want you to write this paragraph at home. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. But if you are really wanting to focus on helping them improve as writers, if you have them write in class when you're there to actually walk around the room, look at what they're doing, and give them immediate feedback on what's going on, or help getting them unstuck when they're stuck, they're going to produce better writing that way. Again, I know that there's a conflict between I've got to teach my content and I've got to have the kids write. It's going to take away too much time. But if they're writing about your content, even if it's just 5 minutes of writing, a quick response to something, if you just got done showing them a quick video clip, have them describe, one thing in the video that they, have a certain reaction to, and they need to provide evidence for whatever that is. That's giving them practice. And while they're writing, that's very good time to be sitting down and catching up on email or organizing your desk. But to support them as writers, it's also a very good time to be going and looking over their shoulder and get them used to having that feedback loop with you right away. If you send them home, some of them aren't going to do it. You know that. You don't know if they're the ones who wrote it. If they go home, some of them, if they're really struggling, they may have somebody either dictate it to them or write it for them. And the ones who are struggling are never really going to get the benefit of your help if you're not nearby while they're working through that process. So if you can provide some time in class to have them write, they are going to improve faster, much faster. Okay, number 5. Require students to read their writing out loud. Now, this is not what it sounds like, because I think it sounds like you should have them perform all of their reading or their writing, or you should have them, each read each piece to the whole class out loud. And that is not what I mean. This is what I mean. One of the most effective revision strategies for finding problems in your writing is to just read it out loud to another person, or even to just read it out loud to yourself. But somehow having that other person for accountability, it makes it better. And here's some proof of it. Have you ever written something and you think it's fine, and then maybe you have to read it out loud in some kind of a context, and as soon as you start reading it out loud, all of a sudden you go, oh, God, I didn't notice that before, or wait, that didn't sound right. Only when you read things out loud do you find problems, but it is the simplest way to find problems in your writing. So here's what I have done, and this is what I find works really well. Whenever students say, okay, I'm done with this draft, or I think it's ready, or whatever, make sure that you build into that process at some point where they get together with a partner, and person A holds their paper in front of them and starts reading. Person B looks over their shoulder or looks at the paper alongside with them, and the person B is actually reading the writing while they listen to person A read, so that they can see if there's a match. Because sometimes a person will read their work out loud and they will fill in the blanks, and the person beside them can say, no, that's not what it says. You said this, but it says that on the paper. And then they can stop, and they should be doing this with a pencil in hand so they can mark mistakes right away. But it is just such a quick, easy, cheap, free, fast way of finding problems. Everybody in the world should read their stuff out loud before they ever put it out there for public consumption, because you just will always find stuff wrong. So even if you know nothing at all about teaching writing, at all. This is one thing you can do so easily, is just make sure your students read their work out loud to each other, and they will find mistakes that you won't have to catch later. So just build that into the revision process with them. And I would say it's something they could do more than once. If they do it and they make mistakes and they fix it, then they could maybe do another read aloud the next day. But they never have to get up in front of the whole class and read out loud. Just use it as a practice. And if they can't get into partners and they just want to go off into a corner by themselves and read it out loud, they can do that. But if they tell you, I can just read it in my head and I'll find stuff, don't let them get away with that, because that is not a good way to find the mistakes. For some reason, reading it out loud helps you find stuff faster. So, okay, that's number 5. Number 6 is grade samples of writing with them. If you have some sort of a rubric, or if your school or your state or whatever uses a sort of standardized rubric to score pieces, a lot of times you'll see this with standardized testing. If they have to do some sort of a constructed response to something, there will be a basic rubric that gets used to score them. It is really enlightening to students, and it really improves their skills if you can show them a sample piece and, as a class, grade it and talk about why you would give it this number for this, and why would you give it this score for that, and why would you take a little off for this problem. When they see how that rubric translates into an actual piece of writing, it really clarifies some of those criteria for them. What I used to do, and if you are willing to take a little bit of time to do this, it's the kind of thing that you can do once and then you can reuse it year after year. I would actually write up fake examples that would sort of represent work that was right on the mark, work that was a little off, and maybe work that was a little bit above the mark that we were looking for. And kids are usually pretty surprised at what is considered to be quality and what is considered to be a little bit worse. They tend to be harder sometimes on the writing than you would be, and other times they're way easier. If somebody just uses a clever word or a big word, they say, oh, that's great, that gets the highest score. And to explain to them that just using a really interesting word is not necessarily what this particular rubric is looking for. So it's a really interesting intellectual exercise to hand out an example for everyone to look at and talk about what score you would give it and why, and really get into the details, point out specific sentences where you think that's where this person really earned that piece of it or this piece of it. I would advise you to not use student examples for this, and that's a really common practice, to just sort of take the name off of something and use that as an example. I think it's okay if it's student writing from a year or two before and it's really hard for students to identify who it is. But I've just heard too many stories of students who are sitting in the room and their piece gets put up. And even though no one necessarily knows it's them, they know it's them. And when errors get found, they're just horrified, especially if everyone's treating it like it's this anonymous thing. People tend to tear into a piece of writing if they think the person's not in the room. So I would avoid doing that, even if it's something you want to hold up as a good example, because that can also really embarrass kids if theirs is being shown to be, the best example. It's not too hard to actually write one up where you're just kind of sticking in the problems and make them kind of obvious. But anyway, grading examples with them is a really good way to get them to understand what's expected of them. Okay, strategy number 7 is let them redo things. Even if you're not planning on giving them a higher score, which I would advise you to give them a higher score for things, but giving them a score on something should not be the end of the road for that particular piece of writing. And sometimes it can actually count as an additional assignment. If a student does poorly on something, or even if they do sort of okay on something, you can actually require them to revise it again and turn in an improved piece. Even if they did pretty well on it, they can find ways to even up the game a little bit more and improve it. Instead of just sort of repeating the same problems on new assignment after new assignment after new assignment, if you let them redo something, it really gives them good practice in thinking through some of the problems that they've made, and sort of trains them to maybe not make those again, because they're getting a chance to really dig into one piece. Okay, and so I said there was going to be a bonus strategy, and this one is not necessarily about working with the kids, but I think this is definitely a way that you can learn how to support the writers in your class, or the students in your class in their writing, better than maybe what you're doing with them right now. And that is to calibrate your scoring with an ELA teacher or a language arts teacher. In other words, get a piece of student writing, even get an assignment one of your kids just turned into you, and find an English or a language arts teacher in your building that you trust, somebody who you respect, and see if they'll sit down with you for 10 minutes with that piece of writing and tell you what they would have scored it and how they would have scored it and why, and have them explain it to you and see how closely you're matched to them, because you will probably learn some things about what a language arts teacher or what a writing teacher looks for, and they may be a little bit different from the things that you looked for yourself. You may have had a string of teachers in your own schooling that were very, very picky about certain things, that maybe these are not things that are necessarily considered to be important anymore, maybe. I'm thinking about the use of contractions. There are some teachers who are extremely picky and would score something down if a student ever dared to use a contraction in an academic piece of writing. That's not necessarily going to get them marks off of an AP exam or of a state standardized test or of a college paper, although it could, depending on who their professor is. But just having that conversation with a language arts teacher about, what do you all score for? What do you look for? What are you teaching in your classes? Just having them look at how you're scoring something and tell you how they would score something, I think it could be very illuminating. It would take a little bit of bravery just because you're humbling yourself and saying, look, this is something I don't necessarily know about. But you're not really asking them to teach you how to score. You're really asking for them to score it and tell you why. And tell you why they would give that score to that piece of writing. So that's just a little bonus. This is if this is something that you feel like you really would like to get better at, that's a super simple way of doing it. And if you are not a huge fan of what this one particular person tells you, then go find somebody else. You may have picked somebody who's got some bizarre ideas about writing, and those people are out there. So especially if you talk to 2 or 3 people and they all say kind of the same thing, then that's an education right there. That's showing you, okay, maybe I've been paying way too much attention to this thing and I need to pay a little bit more attention to this skill instead. And those conversations are going to inform the way you interact with your students, especially if you're giving them time in class to write. Then you're going to be able to say to them, hey, I'm noticing that you're not using any transitions in your writing. That might be a term that you just don't use very much in your science class, but because you talked to the language arts teacher a little bit, you're realizing transitions are pretty important for keeping a paper organized. That'll just weave its way into your instruction also. And it's something that takes 5 seconds, and then you can go back to teaching the science. But if the kid is writing about, ecosystems or something, and they're really getting into the content, which is what you want them to do, but if you've got some vocabulary to talk about their writing and you know what's important to focus on, then you can just continue to support that kid when they're in your class. So that is it. 7+1 strategies for helping students become better writers in your classroom. I hope this is helpful. I am planning on following this up with another episode later on about how to support students reading. So look out for that. It'll probably be a couple episodes down the line. For a full transcript of this episode, go to cultofpedagogy.com, click podcasts, and look for episode 14. While you're at it, click on the craft to find all of my resources to help you constantly find new ways to hone your teaching craft. Thanks for listening and have a great day.